All right, so I'm going to be talking about the Dunning-Krugar effect and its evidence for generalizability across demographics. The original Dunning-Krugar study was done in 1999 at Cornell University. It was titled Unskilled and Unaware of It, and they gave 4 different tests, one in humor, 2 in logic, and 1 in mathematics to a random sample of Cornell students. And they asked them to go complete the test and then estimate how many questions they got correctly and how many questions they thought they did better than their peers. And so what they found was that the bottom quartile of students routinely overestimated their own abilities. And this is what we call the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's when someone who has low skills thinks they have higher skills than they actually do. And so they kind of concluded that there was a dual burden, both of reaching these erroneous conclusions, but also that their incompetence robs them of the metacognitive ability to realize it. So this is what their graph looks like. So the diagonal line is what their real scores are, and then this more flatter line is what they thought their scores were, and then what they thought their ability was. So as you can tell, all the people who scored really lowly think they're a lot better than they are. And they also found that those who score pretty highly underestimate themselves a little bit, but that was not the original focus of their study. It was just something interesting they found as well. So my question is, how does the Dunning-Kruger effect affect different demographics? As I'll talk about a little bit in my literature review, there's been a real lack of participants that are not white male college students, and for it to be generalized to the entire population of humanity, like, should probably get a few more demographics. So that's what I'll be taking my main look at. So my first paper that I'll talk about a little bit is the Dunning-Kruger effect in Emirati college students by Coutinho, Thomas, Frederick Lohman, and Bondaruk from Zayed University in the UAE. So they had participants come in, there's 30 female Emirati college students, and they were doing a matrix reasoning task on a laptop, and they gave them 2 trials to get acclimated to the system, and then they went through 30 real trials. And what they found is that their results were almost identical to the original study from Dunning and Kruger. This is significant because this is one of the first studies that had people not from Western cultures and that was predominantly female. And I gathered a lot of how I was going to do my research from this study specifically in regards to demographics. Second one I'm going to talk about a little bit is age-related reduction of the confidence-accuracy relationship in episodic memory, effects of recollection, quality, and retrieval monitoring from Wong, Kramer, and Gallo from UChicago. So they brought in a bunch of participants, and they were shown pictures that were in different colors. So they're either in full color or they're in black and white, and then they're shown different fonts. They were either in blue or red, and they had to remember which was which, and they were all randomized to make sure that there was no other factors in the process. And what they ended up finding was that older adults often had reduced recollection and memory accuracy, and they were also a lot less confident when they were correct in their analysis. So overall, just cognitive ability kind of slows down over time, especially in terms of recollection. And then lastly, adult age differences in the realism of confidence judgments, overconfidence, formal dependence, and cognitive predictors from Hansen, Roman, Jocelyn, and Goran Nielsen. So they had previously done some research on metacognitive ability. So they had a large participant pool as is. They mailed out a survey to all of them, and they were asked to estimate a random country's population from a list of like 50 countries. And then they had to build a 80% confidence interval. So the idea was that they had to build a range of numbers between, say, 1 million and 3 million, and they were 80% certain that the population of said country falls in that range. And their biggest conclusion was that you can kind of make up for the reduction in general ability in metacognition as you age, just with greater knowledge and experience that you gain just by living. And so these 2 studies were the biggest support in helping me with the differences in metacognition, especially in regards to aging. So on to my method now. I created an anonymous Google form. So I had 3 different tests. I took the logic test from the LSAT, just like Dunning and Kruger did in their original study. I took my grammar test from Oxford's English and Grammar test, which is also what Dunning and Kruger did in their original study. And then my mathematics test was sampled from the May 2019 SAT because I assume most of my population probably did not take that version of the SAT, so it's unlikely that they would have previous experiences with those questions. And then after each set of 10 questions, I would ask participants how confident they were and how many answers they had gotten correctly. And then at the end of the whole thing, I asked them for some of their demographics. And so the way that I would plot my results with this method is very similar to theirs. I would have their real scores, which would look diagonal, and then their expected scores based off of their confidence analysis. And the difference between these two scores is what I would call the Q score for each demographic. So this is the results for all of my participants. So as you can tell, as you get lower down in your real score, your expected score is a lot higher on average than what your real score is. And then as it gets a little bit higher, it's, especially around the middle, it's very similar to what it is. And then as you get higher, it's a little bit lower. So like I just mentioned, the difference between these two scores is what I'm going to refer to as the Q score for the rest of this presentation. So the Q score for the bottom half of all of my participants is 3.6875, which is pretty significant. That means that there's pretty severe miscalibration between their real skill and their expected skill. And for the bottom quartile, it was even worse with a score of 4.125. So jumping into some of the demographics now, the two races that had the largest amount of responses and that were statistically significant were white participants and Asian participants. White participants in the bottom half had a Q score of 3.33, and in the bottom quarter it was 3.833. As you can tell, it's rather miscalibrated here on the left side of the graph. For Asian participants, their bottom half Q score was negative 0.33, and their quartile score was negative 0.5. And then age differences was another one that I looked at pretty heavily, specifically the 16, 17, and 18-year-olds. The 16-year-olds in the top left, their bottom half Q score was 1.25, and their quartile was 4.5, so you can see it's a pretty significant miscalibration, especially as you get further left on that graph. For 17-year-olds, the bottom half Q score was 7.83, and as you can see on this graph, there was not a single one in the bottom half that didn't overestimate themselves. And their bottom quartile was 10.67, so you can see this is a rather large disparity. And then for 18-year-olds, their bottom half Q score was 2, and their bottom quartile Q score was 2.5. So still pretty miscalibrated, but not quite as significant as the other two. So on to some analysis now. Firstly, with the Dunning-Krugar effect, we have to prove that I found it at all before even talking about differences in demographics. And although my results weren't quite as significant as some of the other results in the current literature, those in the bottom quartile of the total population significantly overestimated themselves by at least 25%. So that means that the people who score between 0 and 25% percentile-wise believe that they're above average, which is pretty significant and definitely indicative of finding the Dunning-Krugar effect. So now that we've established that, I can go ahead and start talking about the influence of these demographic differences on the Dunning-Krugar effect. So I'll start with age. Naturally, like with biology and kind of just like human experience, you would expect that as someone gets older, they're going to be a little more calibrated in their judgment of their own skill, which makes sense, I think. But interestingly enough, my findings had the 17-year-olds wildly miscalibrated when compared to the 16 and 18-year-olds, and then just the total population as a whole. Because the 16-year-olds were a little bit more miscalibrated than the average score, and the 18-year-olds were slightly less miscalibrated. And you would expect that as the age goes up, that they would become more and more closer to their actual skill level. But this was not quite the case, as the 17-year-olds seemed to be much higher than one would have expected with these sorts of hypotheses. And what was also interesting about that group was that it was the largest group size, and there were no significant outliers within the group. So it wasn't like anyone pulled the data significantly, it just kind of happened that way. And the reasoning for this is not quite clear, but I'll touch on that a little bit later. Moving on to the racial demographics, as I showed on the last couple slides, the Asian participants significantly underestimated themselves, and some people might see that and then immediately say, well, okay, obviously the Dunning-Kruger effect's not in play here. And that would make sense. However, they consistently underestimated themselves, where 57% of them thought that they did worse than they actually did. And if the Dunning-Kruger effect was just not present at all, then it'd be a lot more random, and it wouldn't look like that did, where it's like consistently very low. So that leads me to believe that it wasn't a lack of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but something else entirely. And the difference between the Asian demographics and the other racial demographics was not significant in terms of their religion or age or any of the other demographics I collected. The only thing I would say that might have slightly impacted it is that Asian participants were slightly more left-leaning politically, but when compared to the other left-leaning groups, they were still like significantly underestimating themselves, so it's unlikely that the political group had anything to do with it for the most part. The best of this I can say is that there's some sort of cultural difference between the ethnicities, but as to what that is specifically or why this happens, kind of out of the realm of what I did, and that would definitely need to be researched further. And then lastly, the burden of expertise is something that Dunning-Kruger and a few other people have touched on in their research, and it was brought up again here. And this is the idea that those who are really skilled think that everyone else is as skilled as they are, and so they consistently underestimate themselves. And this is what is known as the false consensus effect. But interestingly enough, this would make sense in Dunning-Kruger's original study and some other ones that are very similar to it, like the Emirati one, where they're comparing themselves to their own scores and then to their peers. But since my study had them taking an online Google form, there was no way that they could have compared themselves to their peers. It just wouldn't have made sense. But yeah, we still find this result in our data that they're significantly underestimating themselves when they're at like the top quartile of participant skill level, which leads me to believe that it's not so much as the peer evaluation doesn't influence it as much as something else, and what that is specifically, again, is kind of out of the realm of my research, but it should be researched further. There were a few limitations in my study. Firstly, my sample size was rather low with only 33 total participants. So this isn't incredibly statistically significant, but it does have some credence to it. But definitely getting more responses for a study like this in the future is absolutely vital to make any big conclusions. Secondly, I think there was a large amount of survey fatigue, as there's with any survey. Mine specifically was rather long, taking probably 30 to 45 minutes in total, which I told participants about up front. And I think this deterred a lot of people, considering there's also no incentive like extra credit or any financial incentives as well. And I think it's also possible that because I put the LSAT portion at the beginning of my survey, which was definitely the most intensive one, that people thought the rest of the survey was going to be as mentally taxing and decided to quit halfway through. But how many were that way, it's kind of hard to tell what exactly happened, but for whatever reason, there was a lot of survey fatigue and a low sample size. And then lastly, a general criticism of the Dunning-Kruger effect in total and all the research on it is that if you're going to claim that a participant's low skill level is why they misjudge themselves, then you have to be sure that the knowledge of domain correlates positively with ability in domain. And so kind of what I mean by this is there are a lot of people in this room that I'm sure like know how to shoot a basketball and the fundamentals of the game, but nobody in here could beat Michael Jordan 1v1. So in that realm, your knowledge of the game doesn't necessarily correlate to your skill of it. However, in the three realms that I looked at, which were logic, mathematics, and English, those are inherently tied together. If you are really good at English and grammar, then you are by definition a skilled linguist. And if you are really good at math, you are by definition a skilled mathematician and so on. So these realms are very tightly interconnected, and for those reasons, I don't think it's a significant limitation of my study. So some relation to other work on overconfidence from Ross, 1990, Valona 1990, and Phillips in 1982, all had very similar studies talking about participants making predictions on their own actions and test results. And their conclusions were that confidence on these predictions far exceeded their accuracy rates on these tests. And they also found that harder tasks lead to more miscalibration, which was definitely a conclusion that was also found in my study, as the LSAT logic portion was definitely the hardest and most intensive portion, and it was the one that had the most miscalibration. But interestingly enough, the English section was probably the easiest, but for this reason, a lot of people underestimated themselves, giving themselves scores of 7, 8, or 9, when a large portion of the demographics scored a 10. So it wouldn't be out of the picture to suggest that also really easy tasks, people might also miscalibrate because they think that it's too easy, or they kind of don't think that there's some sort of trick or something like that. And they seem to be the most actually calibrated on the mathematics section, which is probably the medium level difficulty task. So yeah, that is it.